Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Charles Derber, professor of sociology at Boston College. He has written over 30 books on politics, democracy, fascism, corporations, capitalism, climate change, war, the culture wars, and social change. His best-selling books include The Pursuit of Attention and The Wilding of America. He writes for and has been reviewed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Truth Out, and other leading media. His books have been translated into 14 languages. He was shortlisted in 2006 by the American Independent Booksellers Association for Hidden Power, the best book in current affairs. Derber is a public intellectual who believes that serious ideas should be written in an accessible style. His most recent books include Who Owns Democracy?, Dying for Capitalism, Welcome to the Revolution, Moving Beyond Fear, Sociopathic Society and Capitalism. Should you buy it? I welcome Charles Derber to Savage Minds. In your book, you argue that authoritarianism isn't a new or singular phenomenon brought about solely by the legs of Donald Trump, but rather something deeply embedded in the U.S. constitutional framework. Could you explain what you mean by America being, quote unquote, wired for authoritarianism from its very inception?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Julian, for having me. So you're landing right at the beginning of this book. I mean, it might not have been, it's a little bit of a shock for most Americans to hear a story that the American Constitution is not a democratic document. And because, the whole anti-Trump movement within the mass media or elsewhere is sort of rests itself on the idea that the Constitution, created this exceptional democracy. And, throughout our history, while we've had problems, that document sort of landed us in a very secure foundation for the growth of freedom and democracy and so forth. And I'm not sure I should have put this right at the beginning because it is a bit shocking to read, but the basic idea, as you know, is that the founders, I think people, of course, understand that the founders were slaveholders and there was a very, very limited franchise. About 2% of the American population were allowed to vote in terms of the constitutional framework. But I sort of draw out a larger history that I got interested in how the founders came to frame it as they did. And I learned that, these guys like Jefferson and Madison and these famous people, eloquent people, brilliant people who can be pretty evil politically. And it's people are not, uniformly consistent. And there was just a lot of contradictions in these people. So they wrote, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, described all men as being equal, and then, had a terrible life history with slavery, which never, and it got worse over age, actually. But the basic idea was that the founders, who drafted the Constitution were very sort of deeply engaged with British history and British political theory. And they went back to the Middle Ages and the famous document of the Magna Carta, which, do you think most of your audience knows what the Magna Carta is?
Well, maybe we should give a refresher.
Yeah. So I think people probably have heard of it, but might not know. But it's very important because it was kind of the sort of fundamental inspiration of Jefferson and Madison wrote the Constitution. And we know this because we have from historical documents, both images and letters about how the document was shaping them. So the Magna Carta was a document drawn up by the British nobility in the Middle Ages in 1215 against the current king, because he was going off to war in France and was taxing his fellow nobles, less powerful nobles, the earls and the barons and the counts. And so the nobility was feeling like the power of the king was draining their fortunes and was unjustly taxing them for the vanities and wars that the king was trying to wage at the time. So the Magna Carta emerged as a kind of manifesto by the barons being a word for the nobility, broadly speaking, who were collectively coming together and telling the king, no more. We're not going to put up with this kind of, arbitrary taxation and abuse of our money for your ventures. And it became a document that in America came to be known as something limiting and leading toward eliminating a king and creating a democracy. But it was really, and here's the key for the whole idea that you started with our discussion with, the Constitution never, ever imagined a democracy, but meaning a rule in America by the mass of people, ordinary people, being able to actually govern the country. They were following very much in the spirit of the nobility during the Magna Carta. They did want to curb the power of the king, although he remained very powerful. But their real goal was to basically spread his power among the nobility, the sort of aristocracy of the Middle Ages, who had no interest in, obviously, in giving power or governance rights or democracy to the medieval serfs. It was out of the question. It was never part of their, craziest thinking. And it was simply, so what was the Magna Carta, which so shaped the Constitution? It was a document that said, yes, the king has too much power. We'll still take him, but we want a new order in which the nobility collectively, the actual title in Britain of the Constitution, of the Magna Carta, was called the Article of the Barons. And the barons was a generic term for the nobility. And it was really a document for turning power, broadening the power of the king to a tiny fraction of his fellow nobility, who were called the barons. And even that was hard for the king to take, and several kings sort of played around with the idea after King John signed it in 1215. But the British, I think there's this kind of image in America that this was the beginning of British democracy. It wasn't. British democracy really began, the idea that ordinary people in Britain should have some sort of voice and Parliament should have an increasingly governing role in the country. That really began 400 or 500 years later. And so there's, I start with this because it's such a deep misconception about the origins of both British and American politics. And the American idea was really drawn very strongly from the Magna Carta and this, so I call it a Magna Carta Constitution. And I love the fact that it was actually titled, Julian, the Article of the Barons. That was the official name of the document, because we have our own barons, of course, and they weren't aristocrats in the sense of a royal nobility, but they were, of course, the robber barons, the corporate, our aristocracy has always been, from the beginning of the country, the very wealthy elites. In the North, they were the mercantile capitalists, the merchants, who were very deeply involved in the slave trade, I guess, but they were quite wealthy. And in the South, they were, of course, the large slave owners and plantation owners. And the two, the one was a kind of proto-capitalist system, the other was a proto-fascist system, the South, because it was so based on racial hierarchy. But they were both anything but democratic. When the American Constitution came into being, it, like I say, obviously no black people, whether they were slaves or free, had the right to vote. Women did not have the right to vote. Most white men did not have the right to vote. It was a tiny layer of propertied men who were the only people that the people who framed the Constitution imagined could potentially take part in the kind of democratic governance that they were envisaging. So it's just, I think it's quite, I think it takes a while for Americans to, I mean, if you look at the anti-Trump No Kings protests that are going on, I think they've taken the idea, and it's sort of pervaded the current anti-Trump movement in the United States, which I, of course, greatly support and very active and involved with. But I think it runs for many people on the misperception that basically the Constitution was this revolution against the king in the spirit of creating a democracy. And it did curb limited the power of the king, but it never imagined a democracy. It imagined an oligarchic rule, oligarchy meaning simply a rule by elites who felt that they were entitled and who had the kind of financial wherewithal and kind of class leverage, which we can talk about much more, to actually govern the society. And that's what happened. I mean, the Constitution came about in the name of democracy. It's ironic. I mean, George Washington was the biggest slaveholder in America at the time, one of the wealthiest people. Madison and Jefferson, the other great, probably most best known founders, were also big slaveholders. Jefferson had over 600 slaves. Madison also, I think, had about 500. And these people were eloquent about, political philosophy. And I don't want to take away their erudite philosophy, but the dichotomy between the democratic ideals that they occasionally wrote about, particularly in the Declaration of Independence, more than in the Constitution, and what they actually created in terms of foundation of American government were just completely, divergent. The system that got put in place was one in which there was almost no popular participation. There was no voting at all, really, at the beginning of the country. And as it slowly expanded, the power of our American barons, as American capitalism began to get bigger, partly enriched by the slave trade, and the cotton industry grew in the South, and the plantation owners became more powerful and more wealthy. I mean, that's what I call the South, the Confederacy, was really a proto-American fascism, meaning the emergence of the beginning of a very authoritarian system. I mean, there was no really pretense about that. I mean, the South was clearly a system in which a racial caste of white, very wealthy men were put in total charge of the Confederacy. And people who were Black were totally, they could not possibly be imagined. I mean, Jefferson, as he, late in his life in the 1820s, said that even if all the Black slaves were to be freed, there was no way they could live in the United States because they were not intelligent enough or capable of integrating with white people and constituting a public that could collectively work together. So, I call that American fascism simply because fascism is a system which is based on caste and the idea of racial hierarchy. And it is interesting. This is another story. I'm actually writing a new book about the relation between German fascism under Hitler and American fascism in our country. But, there's an incredibly close historical connection. Hitler saw America as the absolute model, the only national model based on racial hierarchy and caste that he felt could possibly be a model for the kind of Germany that he was imagining in the 20s. And as I'm sure you know, he sent his scientists to America to study American Jim Crow laws, the Confederacy, because he felt America was the perfect model for the kind of society that he wanted to produce in Germany. And, sort of the American side of that is that for a long time, back in the 30s, the KK, there's a long history of Americans being American far-right people tied particularly to race and caste, looking at Hitler as the model of what we should have in America. The America First Committee of the 1930s, is the group that Trump took his name from, and that was a group that was overtly, pro-Nazi and very sympathetic. But in any case, I think the main part of the story that the Constitution starts with, and this book begins with, is this idea that we have this creed of democracy in America, not just democracy, but the exceptional democracy, the democracy that sets the standard for, real, popular rule all over the world. And the way America actually historically developed was entirely different. I mean, it's true that the Constitution slowly developed more popular rights over the 19th and 20th century. More people gained the right to vote and so forth. And people took that as evidence that, well, we have a template that can work and we just have to spend time historically. But when you look actually at the history, starting in the 19th century after the Civil War, when, the Northern capitalist model kind of took over nationally, even though Jim Crow kept the Southern, caste system very much alive. But the American capitalist model became the national model. And the robber barons, the Rockefeller, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the initial capitalist elite in America, they were known as robber barons, which I thought was a good another little symbolic affirmation of the relevance of the British barons. We had our own barons, and they were taking up very much the same spirit of governance as the British barons who wrote the Magna Carta. So what happened in the Gilded Age when the great American industrialists like Rockefeller and Morgan took over was that they were claiming that the 14th Amendment, the expansion of the franchise to black men, and the movement of suffragettes, there were a lot of things that they could point to, a growing electoral system that turned out to be a very compelling veneer for the idea that America was in fact growing to realize this dream of democracy, which people felt was built into the Constitution. But what was in fact going on, which I try to spend a lot of time in this book, Wired for Authoritarianism, we were wired for authoritarianism because the Constitution and the way the United States developed legally, constitutionally, and politically and economically after the Civil War was all wired to maintain this kind of baronial rule, to maintain the power of a small elite of very wealthy people to continue to rule a country. But it was a system that I call, as you know, the book is based on the distinction between what I call covert authoritarianism, that is a system of authoritarianism which is disguised and looks very, very compellingly like a democracy, but beneath the curtain, behind the curtain of a growing number of people who could vote and growing constitutional rights that were being passed, behind that rather thick curtain, which was getting thicker, was a more powerful and brutal oligarchy of these industrial wealthy people. And, our first billionaires emerged. Rockefeller became the first American billionaire in about 1891 and was joined soon by the other, Carnegie and Morgan and so forth. And what these oligarchs did was continue to build a covert system of authoritarianism, which was very, very effective in its goal, which was to mask the enormous, non-democratic power that these American robber barons were exercising in the late 19th and then throughout the 20th century. Because behind the veneer of a growing number of, voters and constitutional, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, which were seen as making the Constitution more democratic and so forth. One little symbol of the new covert authoritarianism that was emerging. And by covert, I mean an authoritarianism that was very powerful, but that was veiled behind a credible veneer of elections and voting and constitutional rights. At the same time that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment was being passed, in 1876, just a few years later, I think there's a great symbol of this authoritarian rewiring, which was the Santa Clara Act of the Constitution, which probably nobody listening has heard much about, but it's really important. So what happened in 1876 was that the Supreme Court, which was a court about as right-wing and conservative as the rubber, our current horrific Supreme Court today, passed this decision known as the Santa Clara Act. It was in a railroad act, a railroad conflict. And it basically, the Santa Clara Act was the famous act that declared in the preface to the court decision that corporations were actual persons. They had the rights of persons. This was called corporate personhood, and it became the foundation of the wiring of this covert authoritarian system, maybe the most important foundation, because what it did was it said that corporations really, let me just go back one step in the story. Before the Civil War, American constitutions had been legally constructed as public entities. They were seen, the story of them was that they were seen as creations of the public, by the public, for the public, and to serve the public, which is, most Americans would be surprised to hear that. And they were allowed to make a profit. So it's not like these corporations were benign, but they were legally wired as accountable. They had, like banks in particular, had 10-year statutory limitations. You had to go to the legislature and prove to the legislature that the banks and that the corporations were serving the public interest. And if you couldn't serve that, your charter in the corporation would be dismantled. So the Santa Clara Act, which passed in 1876, was a revolution, and not a good one. It was a revolution. It was a corporate baronial revolution of the barons, which said, hey, we're actually, our foundation here, which is the corporation, is our institutional, bastion and foundation and mode of operation, is not accountable to the people. It's accountable. The Santa Clara Act helped reconstruct the wiring, the legal structure of the corporation in a way that defined it not as a pact between the citizens and the corporation, but as a compact between the investors in the corporation and the management of the corporation. It was a private contract, and it was seen as emblematic when constituting a private citizen with constitutionally protected rights. And as you know, Julian, and probably as most of your audience knows, the idea of corporate personhood became the foundation of this extremely, intense baronial American authoritarianism, which remained covert because nobody knew about Santa Clara or really followed this thing. But what it did was put us on a road toward the idea that corporate money was, this was, of course, crystallized in the Citizens United Act in 2010 of the court. But it basically took Santa Clara and turned it into political, dynamite. It said all the way. It said that any money that corporations throw into the political process must be seen as a form of constitutionally protected speech. So if you limit or try to curb or say corporations should not be able to lobby or buy with candidates with all this money, that's now seen as an assault on free speech. It's like if you attack the corporate right to throw billions of dollars, you don't like the fact that Elon Musk is sending hundreds of millions of dollars into all kinds of different races. That's in the new constitutional order that was created by Santa Clara way back 150 years ago. That created the right of very wealthy elites and their corporations to basically swamp the political system with, enormous amounts of money that were defined legally and constitutionally as free speech. So there was simply no way, if I were to get up and start railing against the right of these corporations to spend so much money, could be attacked, according to the Constitution, as violating the most sacred democratic principle, which is that of free speech, because the corporation, corporate money is being defined as free speech. So that is one core story. So I think probably most people don't know the story of Santa Clara. And it is the story of the building, this rewiring of this covert authoritarianism, because people were gaining the right to vote, elections were becoming more important, but fundamental decisions were increasingly being made by very wealthy corporations that were being given these new constitutional rights of speech and money in the political process. Now that evolved in the 20th century to a massive new kind of what I'm calling covert authoritarianism. And the way that worked, based on the wiring of this new constitutional interpretation, was that the elites, the corporate elites, knew that this was a system that was working really well for them. They were able to get pretty much what they wanted from the government without actually occupying it or actually taking direct political power. So what happened was that in the 20th century, this sort of movement of the barons, sort of like the British barons way back then, built a kind of economic and social and cultural cohesion that made them, just like the early British barons, a kind of class that was knit together by values and common, they knew each other from prep schools, from social clubs which they formed, and then they formed policy groups like what we think of today as the Heritage Foundation, which created Project 2025. For most of the 20th century, the most important of these corporate policy groups was the Council on Foreign Relations, which sort of laid the groundwork for most of American imperial wars during and before and after World War II, for America to take over and colonize much of the world. And what was happening here was that this kind of corporate class it found a perfect formula. It could get what it wanted, which was control over the American government and control over much of the world, American foreign policy, while maintaining a very robust image of democracy through it, and could point to elections growing. Women could now vote, growing numbers of men could vote. And so they had a perfect formula. And so they could spout this democracy, while at the same time they were building both the legal and the class-based institutional and cultural and social connections and institutions that would allow them to basically rule the government from the outside through lobbying, by forming of legislation. For example, you see that now, of course, in Project 2025, where almost everything that Trump did was laid out in the various papers that the Project 2025 created. In the same way, a billionaire gave $1.5 billion to Leonard Leo at the Federalist Society. So they were also, from the outside, were shaping the Supreme Court, leading to the disaster we have in the Supreme Court right now. This whole system was, I call it covert authoritarianism, was incredibly powerful and clever, because it allowed a very small elite of people to rule the nation in the name of democracy, and in a name that appeared credible to a lot of people. People knew that the robber barons, that Rockefeller and Morgan, were very rich, but they still said, yeah, but we have presidents that we elect, and we have Congress, and we have all the appropriate infrastructure of a democracy. So the American capitalist elites basically got something more cleverly and more powerfully, I think, than any other place in the world. In this idealized democracy, they had a very sophisticated system of covert power, which allowed them to rule from outside of the government. They didn't have to get in and actually do it, although occasionally they would very wealthy people would get involved at top levels of government. So what does that mean? I mean, the reason, the sort of punchline of all this is that in the Trump era, the reason I wrote this in the Trump era is that the common sort of perception is that Trump has invented American authoritarianism, that America was democratic until Trump, and that Trump basically, if we can just basically get rid of Trump, we can go back to the American democracy we've always embraced and loved and been proud of. And I wrote the book primarily because of my concern that this feeling that Trump had invented this system of American authoritarianism was going to lead to a post-Trump era, or an effort to challenge Trump that would simply take us back to the covert corporate form of power that we had for the last couple of hundred years before Trump. So if you then say, well, what did this is not to say that Trump was not a significant new development. He did change the country in a scary, freaky, horrifying way. As we're talking, I'm day to day absorbing how scary and frightening, especially as we're thinking about, whether we're thinking about climate change, or we're thinking about, wars in the Middle East, or we're thinking about the elections coming up in the fall, Trump is a very serious threat, and he represents a certain kind of new threat. But he did not invent authoritarianism. What he did was he basically shifted it, and this is what the book develops to try to explain this story more fully. He shifted from this covert authoritarianism that I've been describing, where basically the elites, the corporate elites, are operating from behind the scenes, behind the curtains, to a much more direct, open kind of power of the oligarchy. So that when, leading up to Trump, you began to get, with 9/11, a more explicit, there began to be the development of this idea of the unitary executive and the power of the president to operate relatively autonomously from the legislature and the courts and so forth. And Trump ran with that. And so the sort of checks and balances, which had been part of the disguise, they'd been somewhat meaningful, but it had not limited the ability of elites to run the country. What Trump did was essentially jump on the unitary executive philosophy that had been emerging under Bush since 9/11, and then tied it to what I call this system of more overt authoritarianism, by which I mean the billionaires. And we had now a new, what we have today is a second Gilded Age, and a new generation of robber barons who are sitting mostly in Silicon Valley, the Musks and all of the people that, Zuckerberg and all these AI people who are, concentrating about 40% of the capital of the United States. And these are the people that when Trump was elected, in the second term, surrounded him in those famous iconic photos. And what he did, if you now say, what's different about Trump? Well, the powerful corporate elites are still running America, and in conjunction with the president and the military. They've always been a kind of alliance of that kind. But Trump has brought them directly into the government. So they used to operate behind the curtain, outside of government, in the think tanks, in the lobbying on K Street and so forth. They still do that, but they're now much more directly involved in the official government. So, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is a Wall Street billionaire. The Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is a billionaire. The head guy, Russell Vought, who is Trump's, director of Office of Management and Budget, is directly he's the director of the Heritage Foundation and wrote the Project 2025. So what happened under Trump is not that authoritarianism suddenly bloomed in a way that, we had never had it before. It was just, it took a more overt, open, transparent, and visible form. So suddenly Americans could see, particularly at the beginning of Trump's second term, where he decided to just dispense with all the disguises and politenesses and just sort of putting it all there out front. And he basically created this kind of new model of what I'm calling overt authoritarianism rather than the historic model of covert authoritarianism. And he just says, look, guys, this is the way America is. And these billionaires who have all the money are now also going to be sitting in the seats of power around me in Washington and actually directly running much of the government. So what the book really does is trace this history to show that, the long story of American democracy is actually a story of incredibly sophisticated, disguised authoritarianism or covert authoritarianism, which is now broken out into a much more overt authoritarian and neo-fascist kind of order. And the elections coming up might make that, if they were to actually do away, if Trump follows through on his promises to basically interfere with the elections and not let them go forward, that would be the ultimate step toward what I'm calling overt authoritarianism, because it basically would strip away the main veneer of democracy, or the main disguise, which is elections themselves. And Trump is working very hard on that right now. He's saying elections that are basically fraudulent. They're structured in a way they're fraudulent. And that, so every day he's talking about, suspending or, stopping or not having elections, or, getting involved with them in ways that would make them obviously unable to function as any kind of democratic system. So that's the basic story, that we're in a very scary period, and I just want to make sure that people understand it has this story has a point. It's not just to make an academic point about the way politics and power have been evolving in America and the world. It's to say that the people, which is the majority of Americans, who are trying now to get rid of Trump. And, I do think Trump has made himself extremely unpopular for a lot of reasons, partly because he stripped away the democratic veneer, the disguises that allowed most Americans to feel that they could support their government because they thought it was their own government. With Trump, as he's ripped away the disguises, people are seeing through and saying, good Lord, this guy is trying to be a dictator and just run the government completely for and by himself. And that's going to create a lot of problems in a country that is, historically conditioned to think of themselves as living in a democracy. But the real bottom line, which I draw out in the last parts of the book, is that there's a really strong lesson to this history, which is that a movement to defeat Trump is going to do very little if it simply overthrows Trump and goes back to the Bush years or to the America prior to Trump, because it takes us back, probably in the most optimistic scenario, to the covert authoritarian system that had been running for so long, so effectively, and which had allowed, very wealthy people to run the country in the name of democracy, and which was doing terrible things to everything about the country, whether it was the wars, which were, profitable to the corporations, or the environmental regulations that they were trying to, big oil and was trying to get rid of, and so forth. So in the last part of the book, I try to lay out what an anti-Trump movement that is familiar with this new story of American history. It's a very, very different story than Americans have learned in school about America as a democracy. That if you embrace even parts of this story that I'm telling, it means that an anti-Trump resistance has to be much more than anti-Trump resistance. It has to be working very hard to frame a kind of movement that takes us not only past Trump, but in the process, past the entire system of covert control that has ruled the country for a couple of hundred years now. So I sort of that goes from everything from changing the Santa Clara idea that corporate money is free speech and should be and can't be curbed, to changing the structure of the Senate and the Electoral College, which always reflected this mass, covert authoritarianism, to really breaking up. In the end, this says you can't really have democracy, which is what the people on the streets are fighting for, without a major economic change, because political and economic democracy are extremely tightly intertwined. The story of the robber barons is the story of the inevitable intertwining of economic money and economic elites with political elites. And so what I'm hoping the book will do is that enough people who are, critical of Trump and scared by him and freaked out by him, as they should be, because it could get, as you were saying, things could still get a lot worse, with the elections being called off or rigged or whatever, and a lot more, that this might help people think about what kind of new movement or what kind of things that are going on in the current anti-Trump resistance we need to really highlight and build on. And there's hope, a lot of hope about this. This is a sort of not a happy story about America, but it has a potentially happy ending if you know the story, because the resistance has already, you've gotten Bernie Sanders and AOC and a bunch of Democrats who were not particularly progressive or economically populist, who are now moving toward the idea that anti-Trumpism means, concentrating on dealing with the power of the corporate oligarchy, these billionaires. And, that's become, I think, the most important idea, along with Trump's own crazy, dictatorial personality and bullying and so forth. There's a kind of emerging consensus in the country that there's something fundamentally wrong with the structure of the economy, which is creating more inequality than we've ever seen in the history of the country, which is seeing more concentration of wealth in these new robber barons, more direct connection of corporate elites over these existential issues of environmentalism, of militarism, these really things that are going to, now involve life and death of the planet and so forth. So I think while the book has a story that's not a happy story about American democracy historically, there is a history of, whether it's the abolitionists or the populists of the 1890s or some of the New Deal reformists, and then the 60s sort of more radical. We have a history which says there has always been a current of Americans who have understood this story, who have understood that America operates in an authoritarian, disguised but powerful authoritarian way. And I think we're seeing now in the anti-Trump movement, it started with Occupy Wall Street, and we're seeing now, given the extreme, insecurity that about 2/3 of the American public is experiencing economically, where about 60 to 70% of Americans say they're living paycheck to paycheck. They're really in trouble economically. I think people are coming to realize, and they're seeing Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and all these trillion-dollar companies. It's kind of hard to avoid the conclusion that this incredibly wealthy, a class there's never been as much wealth as concentrated in this class, and they surrounded Trump. They're right in now, more and more deeply integrated with the military. The military-industrial complex has been transformed as the Silicon Valley technology has become central to the way that new autonomous wars are being fought through AI triggers and so forth. So we've got a new, more visible set of enemies of democracy that I think the country is beginning to see and to mobilize around. Now, whether we can actually create, because this leads you toward a question about what the Democratic Party is and whether the Democratic Party is a party that is capable of moving beyond the covert authoritarian. Because, what covert authoritarianism did was it ensured that that there were two main parties in America. I used to call them Bush and Bush Light, and they were both parties of corporate power. So any real change in the whole history of this covert authoritarianism in America means that we need some sort of new political formation. It would be wonderful if the Democratic Party, sort of increasingly made up of younger, radical economic populists, sort of operating in the spirit of Sanders and AOC and so forth. We will see whether the Democrats move in that direction or whether we need something different. But the solution to this problem is going to be the formation of a anti-oligarchic party, which we really have not had in America. The Democratic Party in the New Deal came closest to that, but it just sort of skirted the edges of it. So the real imperative in the United States right now is to bring onto the streets. I think the popular base for this is here. The polls about what ordinary Americans believe about war and capitalism and socialism is really encouraging. I mean, about 70% of the population has serious doubts about the current form of American capitalism. They're attracted to ideas of democratic socialism. They understand that the economic, stress that they're feeling is they can't keep it up. It's just overwhelming. It's beating them down. Life is hard enough, given, in the best of, societies. There's plenty of challenges in life. And to add on top of that, the kinds of economic and political and social forces that are, really crushing ordinary people. I think, again, the class division. So if you're college educated, which is only about 40% of the population, if you're college educated, have a job, doing relatively well, you don't see what the other 60% of the country is dealing with, a lot of whom are in the Trump base. But that Trump base has moved in that direction because there was no other. You had, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris talking all the time about how much they loved capitalism and were clearly not voices for, dramatic economic systemic change, certainly not strong economic populists. And so that's what we need. We need this resistance that's emerged in America to fully embrace this kind of understanding of this history that I've tried to lay out, and then the implication is that we need a profound economic transformation, which will translate into a political transformation. And maybe people will remember Santa Clara, which sort of makes clear that I don't know why I think about that. Maybe I have a sister named Clara, so maybe that act stays up. But it was an act, a Supreme Court decision that should be as widely known and discussed as the 14th Amendment. It emerged about the same time. And if you think about the post-Civil War era as a second founding, racially, what it really was in many ways a second founding of corporate power. And the 14th Amendment, the Santa Clara Act, was part of a series of Supreme Court decisions that created a second founding for corporate America and permitted the rise of this sort of covert authoritarian system that I've been describing. And you're hearing a lot these days, and appropriately so, about racial Jim Crow resurfacing, the end of the second founding of a multiracial democracy. Well, we're at that same point in regard to corporate power and democracy, and so we need a new economic as well as racial founding, and they go together because racial and class power are always deeply intertwined. When racial caste power becomes more bigger, it helps capitalism. Capitalism survives on the division of caste, on racial and gender and religious division. So, the capitalism is a system which always claims it as freedom is what it's at the heart because of a free market, but capitalism has, really evolved as a monopolistic kind of system, and it's very comfortable with authoritarianism. It doesn't like it being exposed, but there's a long history of fascist forces in capitalism, and all through American history, capitalism has survived with economic elites dividing the workers usually by race in particular, and racial conflict is the heart of the secret of capitalist survival, because it divides the working class. And more broadly, I don't know if you remember, I think we talked about it once, Julian. Capitalism divides people in general. There's nothing more dangerous to these robber barons and to their power than some sort of solidarity and community. So I've been writing a lot, and touch on it in this book as well, about the breakdown of social relationships, whether marriages, friendships. Do you know, Julian, what percentage of Americans eat all their meals alone?
It's a very high percentage.
Yeah. It's about, the numbers, I've seen a lot of variability, but it's probably somewhere between 50 and 70%. Mm-hmm. A lot of people eat all their meals alone. And I find that a kind of powerful number, because eating alone is kind of a symbol of, eating with other people is kind of historically been the way in which people connect with each other and feel like they belong to something, and that they have a network or community of people that they can, that will support them and that they can work together with economically or politically. Mm-hmm. When people are eating alone, and as it was to the case, smaller percentages of people say they have a lot of friends, smaller percentage of people say are getting married, smaller percentage of people are having children. There's a really dramatic erosion, not only in the economic capital of ordinary people, but in the social capital. Social capital is sort of the capital that people develop through their connections with other people, through the strength of their social relationships. So capitalism sort of works to maintain power through a kind of double whammy force. It breaks down the economic capital of ordinary people. It monopolizes economic capital, but it also sees social capital, meaning the capital that is ingrained in the connections and relationships of people in their families, in their workplace, in their friends and so forth, in their unions. It works very hard to break down social capital. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the strongest Trump people have very, very low social capital. They went to Trump rallies partly. They were hurting economically, but they also, a lot of if you look at interviews with people say why were they going out to Trump out rallies? They said, well, it was the same people who would come, and I get to know them, and we got to know each other, and we felt we belonged somewhere, and Trump seemed to care about us. So, that's another whole element of this. And again,
although he's lost a lot of his supporters, however, because he was elected by a lot of moderate, both former Democrats or people who are Democrats but didn't want more of that, and were a bit pissed off about the Biden robot in office, the auto pen, right? And then you had a lot of Trump supporters that were, frankly, liberal conservatives, if one could use that term. They're ticked off about his getting us into wars. The one thing he promised he wouldn't do. Paradoxically, the media wasn't presenting that narrative until after he started to get criticism on both sides. But I want to ask you about something here, because you do talk about the larger legacy within the structure of our Constitution that allows for authoritarianism. But you know what I find far more authoritarianism than Donald Trump? It is what we went through after 9/11, the suspension of habeas corpus, the black sites that became revealed through both journalistic sources and then to some degree, a larger degree over time, whistleblowers. That was frightening. And isn't it interesting, Charles, how George W. Bush has been turned into the kind elderly painter now? He's the person that we can all love and cuddle, and he's just like granddad. And you saw him at, I believe, Jimmy Carter's funeral. Was he holding hands with Michelle Obama? And he's been rebranded in much the way that the current president of Syria was rebranded. Suit and tie, new name, new beard style. And this troubles me too.
Absolutely, it should. I mean, because it's a sign of how people are missing a lot of what's really happening. I mean, I would like it in the story I was trying to tell. I don't know if you remember, but I was saying that this authoritarian sort of shift that Trump is turning into overt authoritarianism began with Bush and after 9/11. 9/11, the Patriot Act, and there were a whole set of changes that happened in relation to surveillance, habeas corpus rights, and so forth, which became integrated into the more overt authoritarianism of Trump. I mean, Trump's rhetoric, his executive orders, and the way he dealt with, the oligarchies. They followed the Bush model. And after, Bush is an interesting figure because Bush Sr., as you know, came out of Wall Street and was a financial, he was a financial oligarch from the beginning. He was Reagan's vice president and then came in on the racial, remember the Willie Horton revolving door and so forth.
That's right.
So a lot of these authoritarian neo-fascist trends emerged even before Trump. The authoritarianism that had survived. America was beginning a decline after Vietnam, where and as China began to rise, there was a sense that the dominance of America in the world that had, sort of reached its height in the post-World War II era was beginning to fray. And that is red meat for neo-fascist, more extreme, more overt authoritarianism. So I agree with you 100%. And 9/11, which was seen as kind of a sort of symbolic blow to American power, what was just part of a larger story that was blooming, before Trump came into power, an America that was sliding downhill, that could not compete globally, that was needed to sort of move toward mass surveillance and other very repressive means of fighting, terrorists inside the country. You had the Department of Homeland Security formed. Even under Bush and Obama, as you probably know, the turn toward prosecution of immigrants became very intense. The violence against immigrants, if you go back to in 2009, I think it was, the ACLU wrote a report, really criticizing the Obama administration for its anti-immigration policy, violence and policy. So what you began to see after 9/11, in my view, in the context of both the loss of wars and the economic decline compared to, America was seen as on its way down. And being on its way down is a nation on its way down is always, that's what Hitler built on. It's what Trump's whole campaign line was, that America is losing its glory and power and its economic greatness. And if you elect me, I'm going to be the populist who brings the country back to its former glory. In other words, he never governed this way, as you said, but his campaign rhetoric was always about American decline and about how he was going to make the country great again. And that is the watchword of fascism. Fascism always builds on the idea that for ordinary people, things are getting much, much worse. And you need a strong, that there's something about democracy that is weak, in periods of crisis and decline. Democracy is just too vulnerable and weak a system to really mobilize the country together to fight all these internal enemies, the immigrants, the racial enemies, the workers, the communist workers, whatever enemies you want to dream about. And Trump has them, lined up in his head.
Yeah, but even that's failing now because I listen to a load of right-wing podcasts. I could not say that Republicans are more racist than Democrats. To the contrary, I think they are really over the kind of hyper consciousness that the left wants to impose, and I totally understand where they're coming from. That said, I think it's failed him because I think many people on his side, or formerly on his side, but on his side is he really a Republican? That we can debate, but on the Republicanish side,
right,
they're like, he lied to us. He's not, these are true MAGA supporters. A lot of them are really well, look what happened with Marjorie Taylor Greene. She was his biggest cheerleader along with Tucker Carlson, and both have been like, I'm not on board. And so...
Right. Well, Trump completely betrayed them. As you say, he promised everything that we've been talking about. He promised he would be against wars. He was going to bring the jobs back into the country. He was running as a pretty robust economic populist, who was going to bring, the working class and, stop these wars. That was his campaign, 100%. But when he got elected, he did, of course, exactly the opposite. He said he was going to, shake up the global establishment and get these global, enemies that were taking jobs and weakening the country. And when he got elected, the disaffection you're seeing among MAGA people reflects the fact that he is openly betraying them, right? Everything that he said that sort of drew them to him is he's doing exactly the opposite. So in a way, to me, what's more surprising is not that he's losing support. He's really, bleeding support across the board, but that it took this long to do it because he's never governed Hitler ran as a right-wing populist, and he started a workers' party, and he did actually follow through. The first few years of Hitler's years were in Germany, 40% of Germany was unemployed in 1933 when Hitler came in. He ran a military Keynesian policy that invested heavily in German infrastructure, military infrastructure, the Autobahn, German munitions, with a lot of help from American capital. And it rebuilt Germany. He did actually follow through and deliver for, non-Jewish Germans and non-Gypsy, non-Slavic Germans. He delivered what he promised. Trump never did that. The biggest difference between Trump and Hitler in this respect is they both ran saying that they were going to, save a country in decline and rebuild it. But Hitler actually followed through and did John Maynard Keynes in the 30s said that Hitler had delivered an economic miracle. Now, of course, some of this was that he had taken jobs from millions of Jewish Germans and simply handed them over to non-Jewish people as he was beginning his assault on German Jews and other aliens and so forth. So not all of this was glory to God in terms of what he did, but he did follow through on the basic promise of both rebuilding the country militarily and economically. Trump has done the exact opposite. He has simply funneled all this money into these global corporate elites who he was promising that he would put in their place and, bring all their money home for investment in American workers. He's done none of that. In fact, he's done the exact opposite. He's essentially been the biggest, sort of investor in American oligarchies and sort of redistributing money from the American working class and poor to the, like in the budget bill of 2025. that's the biggest in history. So in a way, I would go further than what you said, Julian, and say it's remarkable what percentage of MAGA has remained loyal to him. I mean, there's still roughly around 30% of the voting say that they support Trump. And my guess would be when it comes to elections, it's going to be higher than that. Partly because Trump, Trumpism is a bit of a cult. And he, despite all his horrors, he has a kind of charisma that cult leaders have that really dig into them. And when they're desperate, to give up a cult leader is to give up your hope in anything. I mean, your whole life can fall apart. But I think that, yes, he's bled a huge amount of support. He should have bled a lot more because he's been he's followed through on none of his promises. But, he's still going to get a pretty significant percentage of support. That's the reality. And, that reflects the fact we're in a period of decline and that we don't have a political party that is really willing to speak up and say the truth about the way America operates as a class system and an authoritarian kind of country, and is really mobilizing people to transform the country in that way. It's not surprising that people like Trump are going to keep popping up because the economic and political cultural conditions of the country are so ripe for authoritarianism and fascism. We're just a country programmed back to the Constitution and back to the racial and economic foundations of the country. We're a country programmed to be incredibly receptive to authoritarianism. And also when you have a country that's always been George Washington was the first American who proclaimed that America was going to be the world's greatest empire. The idea that America was civilization's, peak, and that America would rise to become the greatest military and civilizational empire in the history of the world was something that George Washington was saying over and over again. And it was built into the foundation. So when you reach a period of history like we're in now, where America is incapable of realizing those dreams of glory that go way back to the beginning of the country, of military glory, military domination, respect, and control all across the country. Well, now the country is just radically losing, and Trump is playing a big role, partly because of his crazy wars and partly because of his crazy economic policy and so forth. He's doing the exact opposite of what he needs to do to revive the country and see whether he can reverse the decline that he promised to do. He's not doing that. He's doing the exact opposite.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe at savageminds.co. Feel free to comment below or drop us a line to share your thoughts. Support independent media today. Now, let's get back to it. But this makes me ask other questions, though, because I completely agree with you about the way our country's, not just government, it's not just that. You point to it when it was allowed that corporations are individuals and that financing is free speech. They said the quiet part out loud, effectively. Now, those of us on the left always knew that. Uh-huh. But we know even as far back as John Berger, obviously Noam Chomsky and Herman. We've got a legacy within philosophy and communications, media studies, and beyond that who does, as my mother would say, whoever does the paying does the saying. And we know that our elections are decided by money. And to that, both parties are extremely guilty. We know that the super PACs, I say Hillary Clinton's name here, but the super PACs poisoned American politics, but even before.
That's why I said we've always had, Bush and Bush Light. We've had two corporate parties, right? And then,
Absolutely. And so what do we do then? I mean, if we look at the shift from George W. Bush then to Obama got very little pushback. Now, he was really bad. He was called the deporter in chief. Remember that? But we
Right,
saw
yes.
only the left activate against Trump. Now, this is something that I'm critical of, because even though the Democrats are not the left that I recognize as left, they're not Republicans. But now the two parties are often indistinguishable, I have to say. Look what's happened with Gaza. Look at the failure to address the human rights violations there, or Yemen, or the fact that we have our BFFs in the Gulf region that are supporting what is going on in Sudan. They are directly shipping arms to Sudan, right? So I'm very worried that when I see these now two major No Kings marches, I look at a group of people with well-meaning ideas, but I don't think there's an organization or a central message here that is going to produce any kind of political praxis, if you follow me. And that's my criticism of No Kings, because I don't think it's enough to say, well, Trump is, I'm paraphrasing, Trump is like our post-colonial neoliberal / democratic / Republican, because what is he really, king, and we stand against this. And I was very disappointed that the No Kings March couldn't go much, much further in advancing more serious ramifications if our support of Israel does not stop, if we stop treating education as a tertiary element of our society. Look what's happening in the U.S. Institutions are shutting down liberal studies departments. I don't mean that particular field, but they're history, English, philosophy. These are being looked at as, we don't need that, but we'll keep dentistry and banking and finance.
Right. Well, Julian, that's exactly what I've been saying, that we have two corporate parties, the Democratic Party, and I mentioned Hillary and, Kamala and so forth, Obama. I mean, these people are basically wedded to the fundamental covert authoritarian capitalist society that we have. And the question, and I said, as I was saying, I was trying to bring this out. I've been involved with the resistance. I know how a lot of the people in the resistance are thinking. I'm incredibly grateful they're there. I'm extremely surprised about the kinds of people who have been able to reach out and feel real empathy for immigrants, and to really recognize that there's something horrific going on. And, it's reaching into both the oligarchy, the hatred of, rich, the AOC and Bernie. I mean, they're very popular in the resistance. And they're also very aware of the war stuff. You see a lot of, not enough. I mean, I think the military stuff, whether it's around Gaza or broader American military dominance, that is the hardest nut to crack in the Democratic Party. You have a lot of Democrats who are marching in the resistance who are still militarists, and they're anti-Trump, and they're for a somewhat better distribution of wealth in the country and economic reforms, but they're dyed-in-the-wool, militarists. And the one thing that I found some hope in that regard, do you remember when Gaza started in 2020, what was it, 2023, that Sean Fain, the head of the UAW at the time and organizing graduate students in universities around the country, came out with a very strong anti-war message. And I thought there was some hope there, because, the story of the American labor movement during the 20th century has been one of a Cold War labor movement, a labor movement that was economically confined to collective bargaining, but had some potential during the New Deal, and then was just sort of swallowed up by the Cold War after World War II, and could never disentangle itself from American militarism. And so I think that the question, I thought I had said this before, agree with you, that the greatest danger about the resistance, the anti-Trump resistance, as wonderful as it is in many ways, is that it will normalize everything that came before Trump. That say that if we can just get rid of Trump, we can go back to the economics and the military policy of what came before. And that would be a disaster, and it would just be laying the foundation for a new Trump. So much of this book is actually an effort to say to the movement, which I'm very grateful for, but to say that you've got to keep your eyes on the ball. I mean, you are listening to Bernie. Bernie is good on the economy. He's pretty good on the military. You've got to really sort of build that sector of the resistance up, because it's absolutely essential to victory. And you're seeing, I think, we haven't seen the latest No King's March, but I think that's going to be the interesting question as to whether the resistance and the Democratic Party is going to begin to recognize that we got to move beyond just Trump. I mean, it's really, really important to oppose Trump. But it's also incredibly important to impose him in a way that when you bring him down, if you can, that you create the foundations for not going back to the pre-Trump Democratic Party or the pre-Trump economic model or the pre-Trump military framework. That is complete disaster. And you have people like Seth Moulton, who's running for Senate in my state of Massachusetts. The guy is a militarist, and that's a big part of the Democratic Party. And so it's going to take a lot of work. I'm hoping that the labor movement and that the parts of the resistance that are more economic populist and have at least some, sort of the sort of Chomskyite, anti-militarist, propagandistic, surveillance sector of the resistance I think is growing, partly because the oligarchy that now needs to be opposed is part of a huge part of the military-industrial complex and is central to the surveillance state that you were talking about in relation to after 9/11. Who is going to run with the kind of George W. Bush post 9/11 era of mass national surveillance and repression? It's these oligarchs who are using, whose technology has now become central to the military, both in actual war fighting and maybe even more important is domestic surveillance of people who are protesting on the streets of America. If you go out on the streets today, you're in Italy. But if you went in America, everything you did on the street would be recorded. And when you opened your phone and went on your phone, there would be a good chance that things that you said on your phone would be recorded and get to Google and then get accessed or get into Palantir's list and become part of the new authoritarian regime that the next Trump is going to bring, or Trump himself is going to bring.
Well, not even Trump, it's already here. Europe is way behind the US on this. I've been fighting for the past few months. I've become a real pain in the ass here where I live because I've been fighting the school system here. They have you sign these papers to allow your kids to use Google. And I'm like, no. They can use the internet, of course, but why Google? I offered my time. I've even offered to develop their online system that's not Google. I can do it for free. I've offered to help them to get off the tit of Google, as it were. You know what Google does? It's just what Monsanto did to farmers. It does still to farmers experiencing, let's say, drought, flood. This happened in Haiti. I saw it firsthand after the 2010 earthquake. They give the seeds, the exact technique that drug pushers use. You get them hooked, right? And this is what has been going on here with Google. And then I'm talking to the teachers because I'm sure they all think I'm nuts. I don't care. I'm like, do you understand that every click our children make becomes part of a future mapping of a future economy? They don't understand this. They think I'm nuts. I'm sure they think I have like a Ouija board or something. And I've had to be very firm about this. Then I went to the level of the region, and they told me to go back to the provincial level, meet the head here of the education system. I got lawyered to do that. What do you want to talk about? And I'm thinking, should I send them? I really hate PowerPoint. So I was joking to myself thinking, should I send them a PowerPoint presentations? And I should maybe kick off with a photo of Marx. Anyways, I did not. And I just said, I want to discuss our children's privacy, the concept of open source software, the fact that there are many other services other than Google to use, what they call here, well, actually, it's a brand name, but every township, every region has a certain kind of software they use so the teachers can put up notes, grades. They can have absences where you sign on to excuse your child was late because you took them to the dentist, whatnot. And I've offered to rebuild their system for them. I said, I'll do it for you. Or you can use these already existing ones. And I wrote pages. That's what I've been doing since May. And the thing is that we are in the throes of people not understanding the danger that we're in. People think it's only about, do you know Facebook owns your photos? Let them have the photo of my ravioli I made last week. The real problem here that we're facing, no, but you know this, is that we have a system, and you'll see this. People like even Tucker Carlson says this, and he's not a leftist in the sense at all that most people would think of a leftist, but a lot of things coming out of his mouth are. He is evidencing the fact that we are on two sides of the same coin, Charles. I'll give you some examples. You remember NAFTA and how that screwed up the rights of farmers, not just in Mexico, but also the US, also Canada. And we all remember the tons of corn that were left to rot because of what NAFTA did and the impossibility of farmers to be able to sell their corn and the suicides that have augmented in all three countries. Yeah, it's not just India. Yes, farmer suicide is a thing and it's massive. So too in the US, Canada, and Mexico. But when NAFTA had to be redrafted, it went under the USMCA, which was the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Guess who Obama had sitting at the table to draft this agreement? You won't be surprised because it's the exact same people that Trump had when it also had to be retwiddled. The heads of big tech. And I think people I wrote about this for a publication, maybe it was Forbes. I wrote about this because I find it very alarming that we know about the revolving door between being on the FDA and then next day you're the head of Bayer or you're the head of name the pharmaceutical company. Same thing happens with big farming pesticide industries. Again, Monsanto, I've had a few scientists on the show even recently talking about this. The revolving door is a thing. You would think that our country would have a conflict of interest clause or thou must not hold a seat for the next 10 years in this field once you have left the head of agriculture in the US government or whatnot. But no, the table attendees were Eric Schmidt from Google, Larry Ellison from Oracle, Reed Hastings from Netflix, John Chambers from Cisco, and on and on and on. This was the 2011 dinner/meeting he had. And again, Trump did the same thing. And I think this is that we've had discussions about this. I'm really against uniquely pointing to Trump because he's a symptom of a larger problem that's never going to go away unless, and this is where I criticize the left, and I mean all the left. I'm really tiring on this calling of Republicans fascists, racists, homophobes, blah, 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 because those are our friends. And I think we should all remember what happened during the trucker strike. It was, again, Tucker Carlson covering that. You had Fox covering it to a lesser degree, but still they covered it. But CNN, MSNBC, all these allegedly liberal outlets, it really disgusts me, Charles, when I think about it. They were posturing these truckers as racist. And then there was that brilliant moment when the journalist goes up with the mic to one trucker and asks him about his being racist, something to this degree. And he says, what on earth are you talking about? I'm black. So, that was the ka-dunk-dunk moment. And I think that the likes of Rachel Maddow and her cohorts have done a great disservice to, let's just call liberalism. I don't mean neoliberalism, but the heart of liberalism and what ostensibly it meant, let's say 50 years ago. And I'm very concerned that the focus on the Republicans, the focus on Trump, this kind of Manichaean divisionism is hurting us on the left, because I've spoken to people on the right, including on the show, and oh my gosh, I had someone on the show about something completely different in the past year. And this person is very much on the right. And we were chatting after, as one does. And he said, Julian, I want to thank you for your coverage about Gaza. My heart just sunk. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because you never know when you talk to people on what side they stand on any number of issues you might have covered the day before or the week before. And this is it. Like, we're seeing this over Gaza. You've seen it. The Republicans under the age of 45 are most definitely not in favor. Yeah. And so what will the future of our country look like if we don't fix what's wrong with, it's not the sink that's broken, it's the tubes underneath. And how do we fix it, given that here in the EU, they have clamped down on free speech in ways that would make Americans on both sides of the aisle have goosebumps? There was the DSA, and it went into vigor about 3 years ago. And basically, there are people that have been stopped or have been questioned by the police over things that they've posted critical of the propaganda against Russia currently afloat all over the EU. Questioning Zelensky, questioning the funding of Zelensky, questioning the kidnapping of Ukrainian men. I have video feed daily given to me by people on this. When I say video feed, I get like 6 videos a day sent to me of men being kidnapped. Now, had this been Saddam Hussein, had this been Putin, this would have been on Rachel Maddow's top of the hour. And we know what she did. We know about what happened with the Steele dossier. And they still repeat the same lies, these folks. So Trump is a creation of this too. And I think it's really important that people who dislike Trump, as most people on the Democrat side of the aisle do, and I don't even like the word dislike at this point, but people recognize that this is a continuum of very unhealthy transnational relations, let's put it that way. How do we rewire our country? What does a democratic rewiring of America look like on a structural level? Not just concerning the economy, but also international relations, where Trump, he did us all a favor. I mean, we should all be grateful Trump's in office regarding Iran, because he has sunk our cred. We are no longer credible on the world stage. And I think that's a good thing, actually, because this is the beginning of the end. You're seeing more and more protests. Portugal, Germany, Greece. Oh my God, what's happening in Albania now? Brilliant. And I think we're beginning to see the people rise up, and they don't care if you call yourself a leftist or on the right or a conservative or whatnot. They are against what they view as draconian measures to repress. What do you think this rewiring in the States will look like?
No, I really agree with that. And I've spent a lot of my time in this and other books writing and speaking about the pathologies and dangers of Democratic Party politics, whether it's MS Now type liberalism or, the identity. I think, you've read a little of my discussion about siloed identity politics on the right, on the left, and the Democratic Party, and how it's just abandoned the focus on class and on warfare that is just absolutely central to any kind of real change. And so I think this critique you're making is very, very important. And I'm not sure that the Democratic Party is going to be capable of dealing with this, because I see the perpetuation of these militaristic kind of impulses that and sort of broader things associated with American global dominance and so forth that really are distressing. Like on MS Now, the Rachel Maddows of the world, they're smart people, but they've gotten ingrained with a lot of this U.S. hegemonic kind of perspective that's really scary. But I'll give you one more hopeful side, Julian, given that you're dealing with a lot anyway, which is that what you said about people recognizing the dangers, sort of like of surveillance and the children in school and how the curriculum is being subjected to surveillance and all that. One thing that I've listened to among my students, and that is very striking, is that these are students who are, they're 20 years old. They log on to Instagram or TikTok or other, sort of social media sites for probably 5-6 hours a day. But what they say is something very close to what you were talking about in regard to seeds and agriculture, which is they say that what they're hearing and what they're getting is sort of the way they put it is we are drugged. These social media feeds are kinds of drugs, and the peddlers of the drugs are Google and these other big tech companies that are, putting the seeds of their kind of, power and communication and profits into our brains. So they know when we get up tomorrow what we're going to have for breakfast. They tell me what I'm supposed to have for breakfast. I'm saying this to say that there is, I think, more than you're seeing in Europe or in Italy, at least among what I'm seeing among American students. There's this addiction to social media and to the surveillance, 9/11 kind of extremes, but at the same time, an awareness. They talk all the time about these big tech companies as drug peddlers, and they have been addicted, and they think of themselves as an addicted generation, and they want to go after the drug peddlers. So in that sense, there's some hope on that front. This is not directly related to the militarism, except that Google and Palantir and these other, what they're calling, drug peddlers, are now so deeply integrated to the military and to the functioning of the American military machine that, we're seeing a transformation in the American military-industrial complex. So you're now seeing the most important players in American capitalism totally. I mean, what you had before was a military-industrial complex, like that you're familiar with, whether it's Raytheon or General Dynamics and so forth, that was very important, but not right at the center. It had played a central role in American politics, but what you've got now is these, what they're calling drug peddlers, running American wars in many ways. The whole military infrastructure is being saturated with these drugs, what my students are calling addictive drugs. And in a sense, they're getting the military itself is getting addicted to the drugs that Google and company are putting out. Now, I'm not quite sure what the implications of that are, except to say that here in the United States, the level of anger toward Google and Palantir and is very intense. And so maybe that will be one unexpected way that some sort of critique of the American militaristic, obsession, I feel that is the biggest problem. I think I share this with you, that American militarism is so deeply built into the fabric of the country that, in a way, the fact that Trump ran on an anti-war platform and that so much of the country has turned, because of the economic problems, has turned into saying, stop putting all this money abroad and start investing at home. Maybe there's some hope here, because the country is in a global economic slide, and its military is not going to solve that problem. It's going to make it worse. So the fact that Silicon Valley has created an image of itself as collective American drug pushers, and if people come to understand how deeply they're now integrated into the American military system, maybe that might be one route that Americans will come to be more strongly, capable. I mean, a lot depends also on the American labor movement and whether the unions will, be able to shed the Cold War kind of mentality that shaped American labor. But I do think, I agree with you, that is maybe the biggest issue of them all, is whether the kind of wedding of American identity to this global military hegemony is going to go away. And I'm not super hopeful. I mean, I'm more hopeful about the anti-oligarchy on the economic side than I am about the anti-military side of things. Because when I see the Democrats who are out on the streets walking against Trump, they're walking against some of his economic policies, but the number who are walking against his military policy is not big enough to make a difference, And so that is, I think you and I both share a real deep concern that element of power, is being, in trend, like you say, in some way. Trump is bringing America down militarily, and we should be celebrating him for that.
Yeah. We all saw it. All the words. It reminded me, it wasn't like a John Wayne film. It was quite the opposite. It was like a Monty Python sketch where one character's like, and I'm going to mess you up. And the other one's like, oh, the creosote man might be a good example. In the end, the U.S. had nothing. And in the end, I know that something has happened today. I've been trying not to look because I've been editing and such, but I'm very happy that I think this is going to get the discussion happening amongst the people. Now, what divides us are class issues. And you started off by talking about this as well. This is the one thing that people don't want to concede, especially those with the money. You spoke about the landowning class and voter rights. Well, this happened also when the feminists were celebrating a few years ago the centenary of women being able to vote. I raised my virtual finger and I was like, not all women. This was for landowning women. All women happened after. Right. So, and the same thing with men. And I think it's really important, while the feminists are all off about women's rights, fundamentally, it comes down to the poor. Everything comes down to the poor. And I think we can't elide the elephant in the room. But I have to wonder if, as you mentioned, identity politics, many people would call feminism identity politics, but these, what I will call micro narratives, to use a kind of Lyotardian expression here. But I think these micro-récits, as he would call them, these micro-narratives, are doing our social work a disservice, because we're broken down into how you identify. Aren't Trumpists the worst racists in the world over there? And women, we're the most oppressed. Men suck. And all men are violent, or male violence and whatnot. And I'm thinking, this is all coddle swap. We need to be working on class issues, not this kind of divisive fragmenting, in fact, the larger groups of people. And this is my thinking about identity politics and how it became so pervasive over the last 20 years, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Jillian, that has been one of my total central concerns. Every book I've been writing about authoritarianism and all that comes back to the democratic identity politics obsession, and what an incredible, danger and subversive, how it is diverting the possibilities of the kind of change we need. In the name of, emancipation and liberalism, we've developed this addiction to a kind of identity politics, which is so destructive and so, class, the whole class oligarchy thing we've been talking about reflects the triumph of liberal identity politics. It just plays right into it. And, in all of this work that I'm doing, I spend, much of this book becomes a return to a discussion of just how poisonous the identity politics obsession has become in American liberalism. Not because I don't think race and gender are really fundamental questions, but because identity politics weakens them and gives support to the kind of far more powerful right-wing identity politics, which is overt fascism. So I just couldn't agree with you more about the need to return to a kind of anti-war, class-based politics, which is explicitly repudiates the kind of identity politics that you see constantly on MS Now or in American liberalism in the Democratic Party. It's the central challenge. The Democratic Party is not going to rise to the role that we think, is necessary until it's taken on and I'm not super optimistic that we're going to see that happen. There's just not enough, there's not enough cogent, widespread understanding of how identity politics works. Although I will say that I teach this stuff and speak about it a lot, and that whenever I do that, people in the United States are very receptive to it. So it's like there's kind of an intuition that people have about what's wrong here, but they don't hear enough about a conversation about the nature of identity politics and how it is undermining the very kind of identity rights and freedoms around class and war that need to be the center of the conversation. So yeah, that's just where we're at. We've been here for 30, 40 years. It's why so many workers have run over to the Republican Party, and it's not going to change until we find an answer to that problem. And most of my writing and thinking has been very heavily directed to that issue.
Yes, and then of course people would maybe say that the DSA and people like Mamdani pose a challenge or a threat, depending on where you stand, to the Democratic Party. I'm revolted about the Democratic Party. Again, I was in Haiti, saw what the Clintons did with the $10 billion pledge to Haiti. Haitians didn't get it. If that $10 billion were given evenly to every single Haitian, that country would be on the level at least of Costa Rica today. But it's not. And we know why. Everyone should read a brief history of Haiti. Numerous articles online about this.
Oh, it's so scary to read about. Yeah, it's terrible.
No, but why aren't the Clintons in prison? Why are the Clintons? No, but there's so many. Out of the two parties, the Democrats revolt me the most because of just that story. And of course, there are problems on both sides, and we're seeing a fracturing of both parties, which is great. What will be the future in a country where we've got big tech and big pharma meeting at dining tables with our leaders, deciding on future policy and legislation?
Right.
It's a serious problem that we all must ask, because much of what, let's say, you and I have to do, if you're teaching at a university, you have to sign a conflict of interest clause. At least I had to in Canada every year. And these are things that should be seen as normal and healthy, but our own governments don't keep to those same clauses. And then we have the triple problem, aside from the duopoly of our political system, and then what will happen with the DSA, which has also been frozen around identity politics. If you followed what happened with the infamous Adolf Reed scandal, and they're deplatforming him over his views about Bruce Jenner in a wonderful piece he wrote that I lectured about this in Britain as well, in several universities, about this division that's happening on the actual left, not the soft left. And what happens when you've got no discussion happening around historical materialism? Because hint, that's leftism. If you're going to throw out historical materialism, you ain't got anything. You're not leftist, right? It resembles a bit of what Reagan was pushing, to be quite honest here. So what do we do then with this third problem of mainstream media, which, yes, it's crumbling, it's falling, it's crashing. We've had the recent attempts to buy out media now, the recent buyout that happened about 6 months ago of CBS, which is failing. It's great. We're seeing that absolute implosion. So people were very concerned about what is happening there with the overinvestment into mainstream media. I wasn't that worried because anyone who's been paying attention, the majority of people are now getting their media through social media. A vast quantity of Americans distrust legacy media. So Rachel Maddow is preaching to people in an elderly bracket, basically. Not to diss elderly, because a lot of the fight being fought right now in all over the States and in the UK against Palestine action nonsense that's been going on are elderly themselves, because they've taken to the front lines because they realize they can't fire us from our jobs because we don't have one. And that was the thinking there. No, it's brilliant. That said, Rachel Maddow is preaching to people who are not going to be her audience for very much longer, and what will happen to the people like Rachel Maddow, etc. And so we've got, activists who on the one hand are exhausted by the current political climate, Charles, but then you have the core principles of universalizing resistance that keep a movement sustainable and unified. What do we do? Because it seems like the means of resistance have to change as well.
Yeah, well, big unanswerable questions right now, Julian. I mean, they're all completely central. I don't know. I see some possibilities because there's so much receptivity. I mean, I have these conversations that sort of are along the lines, broadly speaking, of what you and I have been talking about. And I find in the United States that young people are very receptive. And I don't mean activist young people or people on one side of the political spectrum or another. There's kind of a cultural, I don't know, it's a kind of consciousness. It's not a class consciousness, but it's a consciousness of the kinds of problems that we're talking about and the extent to which both parties are deeply complicit in it, and some recognition of the class issues involved. Lesser so the military ones, although when you have time to address the military issues, they really are, you find a lot of resonance to that as well. So, I do come away with some hope just based on my own experience in talking with people. And again, I'm not just talking about people in the resistance at all. I'm talking about people, I go talk in, bars in Boston or in, audiences which are not political per se, or in classrooms where the students are pretty mainstream. And there just seems to be a surprising amount of resonance to the kind of critique that you and I both share. They would not articulate it that way. They wouldn't advance it that way. But that when you articulate it, they're remarkably receptive to it. So that gives me a little bit of hope. I feel like we're not just banging our heads against the wall, even though we can't see really clear manifestations of big political forces arising in this direction. I feel there is a kind of sensibility in the country that is resonant to it. It's not all powerful. It's not going to necessarily take over because we don't have a political system that allows it to take easy root right now, but it does exist. So there's that element of hope anyway. So
I wanted to ask about the second half of your book, which shifts towards a sober hope, as you call it. What does a democratic rewiring of America look like on a structural level, particularly regarding the economy? And I mean, literally, as we see people being laid off because AI is taking over certain parts of employment, what do you see as maybe the next step in a hopeful step for workers of the world, for even the middle class?
Well, I've been writing about authoritarianism and the resistance to it and what kind of movements. I mean, I would start a little bit with that, and maybe we can continue this at another time. You must be exhausted. We've been going about 2 hours already here. But and I'd be happy to, continue at some point. But I think that the main thing to say is, let me go back to the eating alone issue just for a second. That there is this crisis of people. I see it among my students. I'm in a college that's very social. There's a lot of social life, but there's a lot of sense of being just in competition with everybody because of the job market, which is very fierce, and because of the, just the individualistic. When I talk about capitalist individualism and market-based individualism, which is always a big part of my writing as well, that America is saddled with this culture of, ego and self-interest, and it's reaching a level of intensity that's producing, an upkick in mental health issues, in friendships and relationships and family relationships and so forth. So I think a lot about these solutions in terms of what brings people together in more nourishing relationships. That, when people are hurting, when people are in trauma, either because of personal relationships or economic crisis or, political fear, you need to be connected, and you need to find ways of building relationships with each other. And, I find young people who are on, social media all the time are not finding that connection there, and they know that. And I had a guy who, after a whole semester of our talking about this, announced he had been logged in, they log in so they know how many hours a day they're on social media. And he was on about 7.5 hours a day. And he said, I'm off. And there was this huge crowd, at the end of the semester, this huge burst of applause. And this kid was finding people to talk to off of social media. And I'm just mentioning that because it seems to me that the solutions to all these issues have to do with people building connections with each other, that where they can share these issues, feel some support and strength in coming to terms with them, and that begin to build. I see the resistance, the people on the street. When you ask me, what do I see as the answer to the economic crisis and to the authoritarian crisis, I do think people in these movements are very, very much the solution, partly because, just as in the Trump movement, what brought Trumpists together? It was they went to those rallies and they found bonded together in these large, national, they followed Trump around the country and so forth. Well, what that says is that people who are in a lot of pain and are struggling economically and, psychologically, need to find arenas for building relationships. And, this this idea of a kind of not eating alone all the time, there's nothing wrong with eating alone, but I think most people need strong face-to-face social connections. And students talk a lot about how they're finding that difficult and how much they're gratified when they're able to make it work. So these protests out on the streets, if you notice them, one thing, I like the things I like about them is, one, they're very funny. The posters are very creative. So there's kind of an artistic element of people finding their creativity and expressing it in the way that, I think they're marvelous posters and, costumes and slogans and so forth, which I love looking at. But also, more importantly, the just connecting together and getting to know and sort of coming back. The resistance is pretty good at continuing to reach out at people, bring you back. When I've gone on local protests or resistance things, I get endless emails saying, please come back. And so I see all of this resistance possibility that's bubbling up in these movements as part of this larger problem of reconnecting to sort of break down this hyper market-driven, class-based individualism. I mean, like I said, capitalism survives by keeping people divided and by getting people to compete. And so my general view of this is that you need to find ways that bring people together and get them to, to find personal, satisfying solutions to what's going on in their life in a way that's connecting to, broader problems. Like just the thing that happened in Minneapolis around the murder of, Alex Preddy and Renee Good, and, all the neighbors in that city who began to take their, neighbors' kids to school, make sure they got fed, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's very simple, basic stuff, but I think it's the kind of politics that, something important happened in Minneapolis. I think the reaction to the ICE things there might have been more powerful there than anywhere else in the country. Partly because the murders were so horrible, but partly because the response of the city, which is still going on, is still pretty robust, is, it's a form that is connecting people in ways that give them a sense of, a collective identity and, a community that does do a little bit of eating together and singing together and so forth. I don't want to sort of get sentimental about that, but I do feel like the culture of these movements is, the left has always been plagued by cancel culture and political correctness. I've lived through a lot of terrible dimensions of left movement, so I don't want to romanticize this. I don't feel it's inevitable that left street movements build, very strong collective resistance and so forth, and communities. But it's got that potential. I've seen it happen, and I think the Minneapolis experience in the anti-Trump sort of resistance was pretty, I think it was very powerful. I think it hit a nerve around the country, and people, recognized it and valued it, some sort of combination of personal empathy and real caring for very, very simple but, devastating emotional problems in people's daily lives that were getting connected to, collectivities emerging in a city and politics emerging that was, beginning to sort of link family, psychological troubles, and children, caretaking and all that stuff with larger community and economic and material, kind of collective interests. So there's some version of Minneapolis that sort of seems to me important, to find movements. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the elections in the fall and whether there are movements on the streets. I mean, if Trump sends a lot of ICE agents out to try to disrupt elections, for example, which I think is likely, what is going to happen on the streets? And are you going to see more murders and more Minneapolis kinds of responses? I think, I don't know, but I think that there is real possibility there. And what's interesting is you're absolutely right that, it's not just Rachel Maddow, the whole resistance tends to be, whitish and older. And most of the people, like, for example, students on my campus, who are more diverse and younger, they have not been generally showing up at these, these anti-Trump movements. So a big part of it also is whether there can be a demographic kind of engagement of younger people in these movements. The fact that the Democratic Party is now, engaged in a debate about gerontocracy versus youth, and what the role of young people is in the Democratic Party, seems like sort of an important conversation, because we've got, the political resistance has been, I've been amazed how, the majority of people seem to be in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. And, I grew up in an era where everybody on the streets was, 17 or 18 or 20 or 22. So what's happening to those people of that age? And I think we're beginning to see the emergence of a younger demographic. And we'll see what happens in the fall when school comes back in for a lot of people, and when the elections take place. And I'm expecting Trump to do very serious things in the election, although I don't know for sure, obviously. But that's my hope, sort of, that the kind of, let's call it the Minneapolis phenomenon, which is, also, let's acknowledge that what I'm talking about Minneapolis, I'm not just talking about the community of ordinary people on the streets in Minneapolis. The labor movement has played, and particularly labor that have been run by nurses and teachers, sort of women-led movements. I don't want to get hung up on identity politics again, but it's brought sort of family and social issues into Minneapolis, and the labor movements have played an important role in a lot of these cities now, partly because Trump has been so involved in firing federal workers and messing up the economy in ways that people are really feeling. So I do think that the material basis of these movements is also likely to grow, because we're just in a the war, and the amount of money going into the war, and the, in Iran and elsewhere, and the economic pressures that are likely to get intensified, both by the nature of oligarchy, the level of inequality, we haven't even talked about a really important issue, which is the covert authoritarianism has been tied to a complete reconstruction of the concept of employment. We're moving, the new robber baron generation is moving us from a legal concept of employment that was exploitative, but foundational to, Marx thought that collectivizing the workplace and building a physical space where workers could get to know each other and build some class consciousness and solidarity. Well, that whole model of a collective physical workspace and a kind of legal concept of employment, which binds workers to the company, it was exploitative, but it built a foundation for resistance. Now, the new robber baron, I'm sure you know that Bezos and Musk have joined together in court to make unions unconstitutional and to move toward a new legal wiring of employment. The new robber barons are reconstructing employment around the idea of contract contingent labor, gig work, independent temp, and so forth, all of which is part of this breakdown of relationships that potentially can create move from an exploitive relationship into a resistance movement. But now these new robber barons are breaking that apart. They don't believe in employment. They don't, when Amazon hires its warehouse workers, it doesn't expect for them to be there in 2 years. It's going to work the hell out of them on a contract gig basis for a year or two, and then it expects them to leave, and they're going to be sick and exhausted. And it's okay with Amazon because they're going to go to a younger crowd for the next 2 years. And so, younger people are facing, and I hear it every day, really intense economic pressures around their jobs, around the price of their housing given what they're being paid, and so forth. So when I say Minneapolis, I'm conjoining, I'm trying to integrate that with these realities of people's lives, and it's hitting young people really, really hard. And again, I'm not sure these things will converge. I mean, maybe the extreme economic pressures on the younger generation is going to keep them sort of so overloaded psychologically and time-wise and competitive in terms of getting into internships in Wall Street firms or law firms or medical things, whatever. But I think a lot is going to depend on how this generation navigates this problem of recognizing they're addicted to social media and that it's really hurting them, seeing an economy that they think is really being reorganized in a way that's going to destroy them. But at the same time, feeling that their survival is dependent on making it through that system. And, it has not led most young people into the resistance. So it's not, the interesting thing though is that the toxic identity politics that you and I worry about are not particularly attractive to the younger generation. I've been struck by the fact that when I talk to young people in classrooms, people who I would have imagined know almost nothing about class politics and are just raised on the concept of identity politics and so forth, it's not the case. They are not excited about, in fact, they don't like identity politics. When I offer a kind of universalizing resistance that's heavily oriented to material issues and class politics, they are immediately on board. I mean, it's sort of surprising, but they are. And that's, again, a kind of hopeful sign. And maybe whether that will connect with, quote, the Minneapolis kind of movement, which is, does have a labor component to it. And where labor leaders and organizers have played a role in helping people organize food banks and grocery shopping. They've just got to move and get and mobilize into that younger generation that really needs to be involved in that, So I'm sort of, maybe the fact that the Democratic Party is now consumed in a struggle around gerontocracy versus youth politics. It'll be interesting to see if that plays out in a way that, changes the demographic composition, the age composition of activism. And, because I think that for the resistance to build and grow and become more class, focused, it's going to take integrating younger people into that struggle. And, it began to happen a little bit in 23 with Gaza, but it's fallen back. And when I go, like in Boston, when I go to, No King's Marches and that kind of thing, the percentage, Boston has 140 colleges and universities. It's full of young people. But those movements, when you look at who's on the Boston Common, there are some young people, but the majority of people are older. So I think there's still this contradiction and struggle about whether you're going to be able to draw young people in who I think really do have the potential to sort of move beyond this siloed identity politics and take up an anti-war and class politics. So that's my hope, but I haven't seen evidence that that's definitely going to take place. So I remain agnostic about that.
Bye.